Sorry, the time to start. And let me invite myself for the next presentation. And let me speak Russian. Дорогие коллеги,
well, dear colleagues, although the letters and the language is English that you see on the screen, but I will be speaking in Russian, nevertheless. So this is, I'll try to be very short and very brief. This is just a very first impression about the current nesting territories of the Steppe Eagle in the Bokey-orda reserve and Ashiozek sanctuary. The territory is the extreme west and extreme northwest of Kazakhstan. Well, this map shows it all. That's the Volga-Ural watershed. There is a small no-flow basin of Ashiozek River, which is called the Bidi Lake in old Russian maps, along with the Aralsor Salt Lake. Administratively, this area belongs to three districts of Western Kazakhstan province: Kastalovka, Zhenbek, and Bokey-orda. The nature reserve, the Bokey-orda State Nature Reserve, or we'll call it the reservoir, as well as Ashiozek State Nature Zoological Sanctuary, were established last year. They just turned 1 year old. These are new experiments, new trials, so to say. They were predominantly established in order to preserve the saiga antelope, but also they kind of preserve the very characteristic landscape of this area. There are lots of very rich ornithological core territories. This you can see IBA, that's the lower downstream of Ashiozek River, and there are several IBAs around, which I didn't touch upon. In terms of the landscape, it's a flat lowland with small rivers and flats. There are different salt flats and solanchaks. Mostly it is deserted, arid, and dry steppes, and the northern dominated with xerophilic bunch grasses, grass, and dwarf shrubs. Well, this is what it looks like. The kind of characteristic landscape would look like that. The big peculiarity here is actually saiga populates here, and that's very important for the population of the Steppe Eagle. Currently, this population is the biggest in Kazakhstan. In spring this year, they had more than 1 million individuals, more than 1,100,000 even, but they should be more now. I expect they have about 2 million because they might have cows by then, and about 500,000 of those reside around this reserve and the sanctuary, in the area of the reserve and the sanctuary. And also the saiga population has increased sharply, like tenfold in the last 10 years. In the last 5 to 6 years, apologies. So our work is done by the Association of Biodiversity Conservation of Kazakhstan in cooperation with the administration of the reserve. And the goal of this work was to create a foundation for the reserve so that it could continue, monitor, and protect Steppe Eagle within its territory. So far, we had 2 studies. The one was done in June, July last year, the one that we had this year. So these are more or less the routes. We drove around 700 kilometers last year and about 1,000 kilometers this year. And we isolate 2 fields, or 2 areas. They're colored here in the map. The one covers or encompasses the area around Ashiozek, where the territory is 1,200 square kilometers. And other Aralsor and Araltepe depression, which represent about 2,400 square kilometers. Actually, every year we were able to study only a part of this plot. Well, these are very preliminary results. That's why I'll be just going through them, because we will be processing on them further. And for the last year results, we saw only 47 nests, of which 19 were active nests, that is about 40%, of which 17 nests were successful, meaning 36% of all total nest number. And when it comes to the number of birds that we saw, we were able to localize more or less with certain confidence about 38 breeding territories, of which 34 were occupied and 17 were successful. The same sex 17 that I mentioned earlier. Breeding density was, or turned out for two areas, 4.7 pairs per 100 square meters. I mean, not pairs, or the territories per 100 square meters, of which 2.1 were successful territories per 100 square kilometers. This means that the mean distance between neighboring activeness was, for the southern plot, Aralsor and Araltepe, around 4 kilometers. Whereas for Ashiozek, the distance was slightly longer, roughly around 4, but 4.4 mostly. Well, what we had as a big difference was the brood side, or the success of the nesting, or the breeding. The mean, I mean productivity, not success, but productivity. The mean brood size for the southern plots was a little over 1 chick per 1 successful nest, whereas for the northern plot, which was Ashiozek, it was higher, 2.3 chicks, or 2.3 nestlings per 1 successful nest. So the difference is almost twofold. And that has an explanation. I will tell you why later. And for the northern part, which is also Araltepe, this productivity is even lower, because we started it later, after most of the fledglings have already left the nests, and we were not able to count them as well, to add them to numbers as well. This is what the distribution of nesting territories looked like back in 2022. Well, the green spots stand for the Steppe Eagle, dark green ones. The active ones, successful ones, and the brighter green ones stand for existing visited nests or unvisited nests. In 2023, we have partially repeated the previous route, but we also had added some additional routes. But for these plots, we have inspected 110 nests, of which 34 were active. Roughly 30% of total nests were active, and 24 were successful, and that's 22%. Actually, the fact that these numbers are lower than in the previous year actually speaks to nothing. It probably has to do with the better representation, better sampling, and as a result, more realistic, more truthful reflection of the situation. Well, at least from 6 to 10 nests were unsuccessful, and those were the nests for which we knew the condition in spring, or when we found the evidence of deceased fledglings and chicks. I mean, we couldn't identify that in every case. We were not able to identify the total number of breeding territories, but we only calculated the occupied ones, and there were 40, and of them 8 were successful, which is quite a high number. As for the breeding density, it wasn't different from the previous year. were 4 occupied territories per 100 square kilometers, including 2.8 that were successful. And this year we have distributed them by different plots, and you can also see the difference between the plots. For the 1,000 plot, where the density, breeding density is much lower than for another one. The mean distance between the neighboring nests, actually this time we decided to calculate the successful ones only, where there were broods, and we cannot of course directly compare this with the previous years, but the distance between neighboring successful nests was 6.5 kilometers between in Aralsor-Araltepe plot and 5 kilometers for Ashiozek plot. And the brood size was same as last year. Again, for the 1,000 plot, it was much lower than for the northern one. Less than 1.5 chick per one successful nest in the south, and 2.5 chicks per nest in the north. This year, in 2023, we have surveyed 23 nests that were known from the previous year. So this is the foundation for the future monitoring. So we, on the basis of these surveyed nests, can tell that most of them were and are still empty this year as well. A high number of nests, almost 40%, which were occupied and which were successful last year, have been abandoned this year. And out of those abandoned nests, a little under 50% has to do with the change of nest within one breeding territory. So we can document that one nest has been abandoned, but there is another occupied nest nearby, and another half were fully abandoned territory, for which we can say that almost 15 to 16% of the breeding territories have been completely abandoned. So they were occupied last year, but they are no longer occupied this year. 2 nests, 6%, have disappeared completely. The one has burned down, and the other one has disappeared under other circumstances. And on the contrary, there were newly occupied nests, and there were only 2 of such nests out of those inspected last year, which were abandoned and empty last year. Also, 9% of nests were active last year, and they remain to be active this year as well. Well, all in all, we can conclude that the trend is obviously negative, and the number of abandoned breeding territory significantly exceeds the number of newly occupied territory. So these are some photos which demonstrate 2 nests which remain active and which are still successful. So one on the ground, another one on the shrub. And there is an example of 2 nests that have been abandoned this year. They were occupied and active last year, but this year they were abandoned and not taken this year. As for the birds themselves, we documented 85 adults, mainly within their breeding territories, and because they were associated with the nest, there were 32 youngsters. I'm talking about both nestlings and fledglings that we accounted for on the nest and near their nest. Actually, we this coincided with this period of leaving the nest, and quite often we found not the chicks, not the nestlings, but fledglings near the nests. And there were 56 fledglings of this year were detected without evident relation to their natal nests. They're already outside of their nesting territories, or the breeding territories, and we would find them either somewhere sitting in the steppes or somewhere next to a water body. And we found 3 dead eggs in the on the nest. So this is what nesting territories look like in both plots. On the basis of this knowledge that we already have about the total population number, we can more or less estimate the total number of breeding steppe eagles, and we would conclude that there are about 100. There are 100 as we extrapolate 100 successfulness, of which 50 are successful and active every year. As for the peculiarities of the territories, of course, most of the nests were on the ground. Well, on the ground means they were mostly sitting on some small elevation, small hills, like former marmot homes or suslik homes. And some, like almost a quarter of total nests were on shrubs. I mean, there are two types of shrubs only. The low one and the high one, but it looks like the birds chose the high ones because they are higher and they're more resilient. As for the diet, of course, the small suslik has always been the main diet, the main prey for steppe eagle. But we deliberately did a study, did a survey on susliks in this territory. There were 53 transects in different areas, and we thought that some of the caves, so some of the hills were abandoned and some were active, and about 50% of burrows were abandoned or empty. 90% of orchards. So the depression of suslik, this is not the first year that we see the depression of suslik population. Last year the situation was even worse, but we lack some quantitative data, but the depression is still ongoing and progressing. And subsequently, the steppe eagle cannot live off small suslik only. We only found little suslik remains in 2 nests. Well, these are the breeding territories. I mean, suslik population distribution. So you can see well that the higher density of suslik population exists in the northern part of Ashiozek reserve, and that explains why in the northern part the breeding success was so much better compared to the northern part of this reserve. Well, it looks like the main trophical feeding resource for the steppe eagle are the saiga carcasses. They have quite a high number of saiga antelopes there. While this map is not very accurate, it reflects the density of saiga along our route, and therefore some of the plots are vacant. We just didn't go there and didn't document, didn't estimate saiga. So the red spots stand for the birthing locations, and if you look at the points, these small dots, they stand for the density of saiga. So saiga carcasses, not carcasses, but saiga limbs. These are the most frequently remains that we find on the nest. I mean, there were just several photos, but there were much more of those. We had more findings, and this is what the distribution of nesting territories looks like amid or compared with saiga territories. So it looks like they're really interconnected. I cannot tell you the numbers. This is just a photo. I mean, we're not able to calculate and do the final estimations. Well, obviously, the establishment of Bokey-orda Reserve and Ashiozek Sanctuary is extremely good for conservation of the steppe eagle. It will help us do something to protect this animal, but of course, nevertheless, there's still some threats within the territory, and those threats are no different from what we had before the sanctuary and reserve were established. The biggest threat and the main, I cannot tell you whether it's the main, however, there are 2 most relevant threats. The one is the electrocution or death on power lines. This time, just to get a first impression, we crossed several lines just for a total of 6 kilometers, and we found 7 dead steppe eagles, meaning that more than one bird per kilometer. That was spring deaths during spring migration. Well, we will try to do this survey in autumn, but we'll try to do it more thoroughly and deeper, and we'll have more information then. And the second important threat is fire. Well, wildfire. Well, it is a threat because the nests will burn down if the wildfires happen during nesting periods or during breeding periods. Then it means that the nestlings will burn along with nests. Nevertheless, this fire situation is now more or less under control. It has to do with the increased cattle numbers as well as saiga numbers and saiga population. They both are on the rise. And while we have this population this high, the deterioration of fire is not expected. The potential threats that we did not inspect, which probably exist, disturbance of birds on their nests by human activities. Well, I mean, of course, that is going to be very minimal within the reserve, within the sanctuary. I mean, it might be okay within the reserve, but might not be that great within the sanctuary. There is a potential poisoning by rodents because they do not use any poison, they do not use any pesticides. We do not know about that, but it is still quite possible. And there is a certain threat from roadkills. There are several roads that cross this territory. I mean, there are transit roads, quite significant ones, like active ones. And there is some mortality, but actually we didn't calculate that, and we did not see any carcasses of birds to testify to that, but we had just heard some other people. Maybe poaching also has plays a role. Not poaching, but shooting by the local residents for different reasons. They sometimes see the steppe eagle as a threat to their own domestic animals or household animals. That happens, but again, we are not well aware of the status of this threat currently. But actually, at least the status of protected natural territories helps to address this very threat. Well, the steppe eagle is the most widespread and most functional and the main large raptor in the area. But on top of that, there are two more raptors. I mean, kind of in a wider sense. I'm talking about imperial eagle and white-tailed sea eagle. They both breed in this area, but their breeding intensity is 10 times less than that of the steppe eagle. White-tailed sea eagle becomes important in winter because it winters there, unlike the imperial eagle and steppe eagle. And in winter, it's the only raptor that stays there. And another important species, which is long-legged buzzard, which breeds there quite densely, mostly on the trees or mostly on the cliffs around salt lakes. But in both years, we have noted about 24 successful nests of long-legged buzzard. I mean, there were different nests every year, but we did not actually have the same flora survey, but we're just counting them along the route. Nevertheless, quite a good population. I mean, locally that's quite a density, high density, and it's higher in numbers than steppe eagle, but not across the whole territory. And just a couple of words about the prospects for this species. Well, since I'm talking not about the randomly selected territory, but I'm talking about the special reserves and sanctuaries, which were established only a year ago. So they will definitely have a future. So steppe eagle is currently recognized as one of the priority species for Bokey-orda reserve. It is the number 2 important species after saiga antelope. Saiga antelope being number 1 priority. Therefore, steppe eagle is included as a priority value in the reserve management plan for the next 5 years, both for the reserve management plan and for the sanctuary management plan. It means that the reserve administration will pay special attention to monitoring and protection of the bird, at least during the upcoming 5 years. There will be special reporting procedure, and hopefully it will lead to separate financing dedicated for Steppe Eagle activities. Also, the Steppe Eagle is included in the monitoring program as a specific kind of item, specific object of ecological monitoring, and the reserve will monitor the Steppe Eagle as one of its tasks. On our side, the Association of Conservation, Kazakhstan, together with RSPB, are working, or we're working in our work, and will continue working with the reserve and the Steppe Eagle monitoring. We will continue help the reserve kind of establish good monitoring procedures, good monitoring systems there, and I hope that as of next year we will start doing something for we'll start doing something practical for conservation of the Steppe Eagle. Well, Steppe Eagle. I think we will try to tackle the mortality by electrocution. And also we plan to start monitoring the Steppe Eagle migration from that territory. We hope to install some trackers on several birds. And our continuous task, of course, is to attract additional funding, and we've been doing that so far. I mean, so far successful. Well, that's it from me. Thank you.
If you have any questions, скажите, пожалуйста.
Could you please tell me whether you identified the correlation of power lines mortality death with the speed of their utilization or congestion by the rodents? No, we didn't do anything like that. We just went along this randomly selected 3-kilometer power lines, especially the bird hazardous lines. We simply calculated the number of carcasses that we met. That was in June and July. All of the carcasses were there for 2 or 3 months. So actually, and we found only one fresh carcass, and that was... Well, there was only one fresh body of another, of an owl, but that was it. I mean, most of them have been. How long is the total length? No, we don't know. We haven't been able to calculate that. We're counting. Actually, as for the power lines, that's horrible. I mean, one bird per 1 kilometer. We went there last year as well, and we saw a lot of young fledglings. And I'm afraid that's exactly the problem, because they don't nest, they don't breed, they look for some kind of elevated locations for them to land, to seed on. And I think that's sort of a trap for them, because they have baby saiga there that they may prey on, and I think this is a priority, power lines for Kazakhstan, in terms of making them very safe for the birds. Yes, definitely. We will be looking at this after we do the analysis of mortality rates at the power lines. We will see how that map overlaps with the birthing or with the calving locations, and then definitely I assume that the mortality rates are much higher, will be higher there. Thank you. Thank you very much. This is very, very interesting. I apologize, I don't know much about the Steppe Eagle. Like many of all of you do, but I have a very question. Are Steppe eagles very close to their nests? Do they really kind of have the affinity for the nest? Does the pair use the nest for many, many years, or can other pairs come and take over? So, do they loyal to their nests? I think Karyakin is the guy to answer this question, because he definitely knows more about the Steppe eagles. Or he's over there, and he's willing to take the question. Yeah.